Hello. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for this afternoon's event, and that is Brian David Johnson. I'm familiar with Brian's work because his book, Science Fiction Prototyping, was influential for me when I was getting my PhD in 2019 at Carnegie Mellon University, where I was also supervised by another futurist, Stuart Candy, who's joining us later this afternoon. So futurists and the work they do, especially those who are engaged with design, I think are really inspirational individuals who bring a very critical lens and a very deep knowledge about how we think about and describe and discuss the future, potential futures, all of those kinds of things. So the future is not just something that is imagined in science fiction films. It's actually a site of interrogation for what kind of world we want to be in and live in and prepare for. So I want to begin by asking people in the upper rows to come down to our lower rows. We are taking advantage of the fact that we are here in person, and I have asked each of our speakers to bring artifacts to talk about their work. So I'll give you a second. I'll just hang on here while you gather your things. Thank you. Thank you for graciously complying with my request. Today's, the first portion of today is going to be very conversational. We're going to start. Brian will share a bit about the work that he does and has been doing. And then we're going to sit down and have a talk. And while we're doing that, you're all welcome to formulate questions. We have a microphone right up there, and you can form a little line up there. He has also graciously agreed to answer your questions in an asynchronous way. You can email them to prodev@artcenter.edu. So my joke is it's a BDJ AMA. And, and so you can ask him pretty much anything, and he has agreed to answer. So I encourage you to take him up on that. I'm going to let Brian give you a bit of his background. At the moment, he is a professor of practice at Arizona State University at their School for the Future of Innovation and Society. And he's a futurist and fellow at Frost and Sullivan. Well, yeah, there we go, Sullivan. And in addition to work that I was most familiar with in his years at Intel as a futurist there, he's now doing work in a completely different context that he will tell you more about that I find personally very fascinating. So I'm going to hand it over to Brian, and then we're going to have a seat here and have a chat.
So I will start here. Hey, everybody. So good to see everybody, and hello to everybody online. It's a pleasure to be here. And I can't wait to get into the conversation with Anne, because when we were prepping for this, she kept asking me all these conversations. And I was like, well, I'm not going to give a lecture. Why don't we just talk? Like, we're humans and we're here in the same room. Let's just talk. Come on, Anne. So anyway, let me tell you a little bit about myself just to cue everything up. And I'll do that. And then, as Anne said, please send as many questions as you want. I do this all the time. I've been doing this for about 25 years. So people ask me anything. Like, you can ask me anything about tech and design and creative, or you can ask me about the zombie apocalypse. When will the robots rise up and take over? I have answers to all of these. My favorite one is I do spend a lot of time K through 12, and had a bunch of 10-year-old boys who were like wiggle machines. And I was talking about the future, and we were talking about something, and at the end of it, one of them raised their hands and asked how to build a Death Star. And I answered him. And they were like, you should see them, they're like, taking notes. And again, right, these boys aren't designed to sit still. And the teacher was just like, I don't know what you did, but they did not move. So you can ask me anything. And again, like I know, we probably won't be able to get to all the questions today. And that's why I actually love answering those questions and actually being a resource, especially for everybody here. So please ask anything you want. Okay, who am I? Hey, I'm Brian David Johnson. I'm a futurist. So I work with organizations to look 10 years out into the future. I model both positive and negative futures. And then I'm an applied futurist. So I'm not really an academic futurist, and they're great. I'm not so much like a civic futurist. I do it for organizations. I do it for companies. I do it for governments and militaries. So I do it for people. So we look at a range of possible and potential futures and then backcast and say, okay, what do we need to do today, tomorrow, 5 years from now to move towards that positive future, that generative future, future casting? Or how do we disrupt the future through threat casting, which is, as it sounds, like how do we stop it from happening? So that's really the work that I do and have done for a while. As Ann said, I was the first futurist at the Intel Corporation. I was there for over a decade. And the reason why I was there is because it takes about 5 to 10 years to design, develop, and deploy a chip. And that's what we did. So we would go and work and use this design work, do this type of, interdisciplinary research to come up and say, how will people want to act and interact with technology? And then that would become a specification. And inside that specification, that would then turn into the chip, but would also turn into sort of corporate strategy and things like that. But we actually use science fiction stories, this thing called science fiction prototyping, actually in the specification were stories about science fiction and how people would interact with technology. And to sort of date myself, what we did with smart TV. So we were these crazy people back in the 2000s who said people would use the internet to watch television. My sole goal in life is to impress my wife. So during the pandemic, there was a couple times when we were all on lockdown and we were watching some of the streaming services, and we were watching television together, and she turned to me and said, "Honey, thank you." And it was like a mic drop for me. I'm just like, thank you. So no, that was our background, is sort of thinking about sort of what that is. And we can talk about that if you want to. So that's sort of what I do. And in 2016, I stepped down because I wanted to do more work around sort of national security and this threat casting work at Arizona State University. I still have great friends at Intel, still do work there, and I have a private practice where I do work with people like MasterCard and do a lot of work with the Secret Service as well as the Army and the Air Force. But I'm also a science fiction author, and I'm a huge geek and nerd. And so I do a lot of science fiction writing. I use this thing called science fiction prototyping that Ann mentioned, which I came up with about 15 years ago as this sort of design fiction approach. And it was really using science fiction as an engineer and a designer to design possible futures, to design products. So we've used it to design sort of smart TVs. We did which we're going to talk about, this whole thing called 21st Century Robot, which we designed robots in science fiction, and then we built them. It was awesome. And then we learned we could use this sort of this generative design work that we started designing them with kids, which I will never design robots with adults ever again. The moment you design with kids, what they come up with is amazing. So we'll talk about that. So that's really the sort of the work that I do, but central to that work, and get ready because we're about to go. Central to that work is design. So in that very core of designing the future, so in the work of doing work around national security, working for companies, thinking about the future of fraud, is storytelling, is design. And it's something called effects-based modeling, which is essentially a person in a place experiencing a problem that is solved, or a person in a place experiencing a threat, and then you disrupt that threat. Well, a person in a place experiencing a problem or a threat, that's a really good science fiction story. Right? That's what we learn. That's what science fiction prototyping and this type of work is about. And at the core of that is design, and actually having designers and that sort of design way of thinking. So thinking like a designer and what you're taught to do here. And then the other part is then instantiating it in science fiction stories, in graphic novellas, which is the artifact that I brought. I came bearing gifts. So doing that, but then also it's been turned into movies. It's been turned into plays and experiences. It's been turned into interactive art. So there's a way of being able to generate the future. And I argue that to be a designer, you are a futurist, because nothing great was ever built by human beings that wasn't imagined first. So every single, turns out if you're a designer, you're a futurist, because you're actually thinking about the future and then manifesting that future by doing it by yourself, or even better, working with the team. So in that way, you're doing it. And then on the other side of it is you're actually then going out and making it, depending upon, I had a lovely tour as we were walking in of all the different places that you can make the future and the things that you can do. But that's sort of my approach, and that's very core to it. That's me. Let's get to the conversations, Ann. I feel like we need to have theme music.
Okay. Awesome. Let's see. Hello. Great. Well, thank you, Brian, for bringing us along. Let's start with your artifacts.
So these artifacts are the science fiction. Yeah, we can show it off. These artifacts are science fiction prototypes. They are graphic novels based upon the threat casting work that I've done with the United States Army. I love to tell my students, turns out generals love comic books. Like, it's crazy, right? And I get to tell people, and I go to, especially like K through 12 or my students, and go, I make comic books for the United States Army. It's a real job, y'all. Like, you get paid to do it. But it's a way for me to take this threat work, looking at the future of weaponized artificial intelligence. I just did one for NATO, looking at the future of weapons of mass destruction. So stuff that is pretty dark, but the idea is saying, can we instantiate it in these graphic novels so that we could go to them and say, hey, here's what the future is going to feel like and look like. And they get it and they go, oh, wow, I get that now. And then we pass them this 200-page threat casting, sort of talking about how do we disrupt, mitigate, and recover from these possible threats. So that's the work that we do. As I told Anne, I come bearing gifts because as we came in, I was walking past the library and I kind of just wanted to put this through the slot. Because I used to do that before. I would go into bookstores and actually like subversively slide books onto the shelves and sort of put things
your own
in there.
books as a way.
No, actually my friends' books, to tell you the truth. So I'm leaving these behind.
Thank you. On behalf of ArtCenter. That's amazing. That's great. The next obvious question to me is about, since you're a book nerd and these are comic books, is about fiction and science fiction. And what about it? Why is fiction in here?
Well, I think science fiction, at least for me, like when I do science fiction prototyping, if we really want to get nerdy about it, being a word nerd, is it's science fiction thinking. It's not science fiction stories or science fiction products, because you have things like films or books, and it's all around intent. So the intent of a science fiction story, of a science fiction movie, is to sell books or sell movies. And that's cool. We like that. We all go. What I do is use science fiction thinking and science fiction prototyping as a way and a tool to get people to participatory design and then actually design those futures. And story is just such a powerful motivator. And it's how our conscience works. I mean, one of the things that I tell people all the time is the way that you change the future is you change the story that people tell themselves about the future that they will live in. If you can change that story, I've seen it happen. They will make different purchase decisions, business decisions, personal life decisions, all those types of things. And story is really powerful in that way. And that's why science fiction really is at the core of what I do, because it is the power of that storytelling, but it's storytelling in the future. And so I like to tell people science fiction is the platform and is the language that we use to talk about the future and have a conversation about it.
And so then, so how do these books work? Like the generals who would read these and get into the graphic novel aspect of it, what then do they do with that aside from enjoying the story and the graphic novel?
Aside from getting freaked out. So what they'll do, so the way that these are built is, so they're based on the threat casting work that I do, sort of the futuring work, which at its core has design. And then I work with a production team. There's a gentleman by the name of Sandy Winkleman, who's my creative partner. We've been doing this for over 15 years. We then take some of these stories of people in place experiencing these problems, turn them into these. So you have the science fiction, but levered between each one are little explainers that kind of illuminate it. Say, oh, you saw something about disinformation, and you turn we turn the page, and you've got 1 or 2 pages of somebody just explaining disinformation and what it is and how it works and what's going on. And then you turn the page and you go back into the fiction. So it becomes this kind of platform at a very high level, a platform to really adjust and interrogate the future and what these futures could look like, and then what steps could be taken.
And so would these be read by individuals, or are they used in a group setting and then a brainstorming session follows, or how? Yeah.
So they're used certainly as a way to say, this is what the threat casting report was about. And that's usually what goes to the general and stuff like that. But they're used as teaching tools, really. They go into, this is used at the United States Military Academy, West Point. They're used at the Naval Academy. They're used at a lot of the war colleges to show students to go, okay, here's a possible future around a cyber attack. Let's now talk about it. So it becomes a way to really show them what the future could be like, and then say, well, here is all of the facts that go behind it. Let's talk about what we need to do to make the nation safer.
And so, you said very quickly, threat casting at its center is design. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I think at the core,
or just what is threat casting in a very broken, very, very.
Okay.
Simple
Should we do
way.
a clinic? Okay. So threat casting is as it sounds, it's looking at a range of possible potential threats. And again, we pick an area, whether that be misinformation, whether that be weapons of mass destruction. And then we do research. So it's always a lot of research where we work with social scientists, we work with technologists, we work with cultural historians, we work with economists, as well as looking at trends and cultures. And so that feeds into, then we do participatory design. So we get together between 20 to 70 practitioners. So these are people who are actively working to make this future better. And so we get them in a room and we do participatory design, right? You get people together, but that design is science fiction prototyping. So they're thinking about, based upon all these inputs looking 10 years out, a person in a place experiencing this threat and really describing it. So they're really using experience design. They're really saying, don't tell me about the thing, tell me about the experience of the thing and the second and third order effects. And it gets really messy and dark really fast, which is great. And then from there, we start thinking about, okay, how do you disrupt, mitigate, and recover from it? Because these are practitioners. And so they start to say, okay, here's the things that you can do. And then we kind of go and say, okay, how do you know the threat is beginning to manifest? So we start to identify the different indicators that the threat over the next 10 years is beginning to manifest. Oh, and I got a good story. So going back to the generals.
Please tell.
Here's how 2016, I was at West Point. We were doing this type of work in threat casting, and here's how it really works in the real world. We were up there, we were looking at the future of supply chains and terrorism and cyber threats. And there was a gentleman by the name of Rhett Hernandez. And General Hernandez stood up Army Cyber Command. He sort of did this work. Big fella. And so he was there and we were doing this work and we did threat casting. And then I left and then I came back and here was the report. And then 6 months later, one of those indicators, the first one, happened, that this threat was starting to happen. And so I'm at West Point and he comes running towards me, a very large man, general, running towards me. He's like, BDJ, did you see that thing we talked about happened? And I was like, well, yes, sir. That's what we do. That's why you do foresight. That's why you do this generative design. And he goes, no, you don't understand. Now I know what to do. And I was like, well, yes, sir, that's our job. That's why we did this. And he goes, this is incredible. And he kind of left and went away. And he's always been sort of the largest supporter, because when you start seeing this sort of happen and he was involved in the participatory design, which is so magical. And then he sort of saw it in his life. And now it's really funny because when he sees me, he's now retired. I saw him for the Philadelphia once at a IEEE computer conference, and the elevator door opened and he came walking out and he's like, BDJ, and he hugged me. And getting hugged by a general is really weird. And basically you just stand there and get real small. And I was just, no, but he's a super, super guy. But that just speaks to the sort of the power of this stuff, that when you can go and use this type of design, because it is generative. Even when you're doing the threats, you're really thinking about a range of threats, and then you're enabling people. You're actually giving them agency to then do something about it. And that's the fact of design, of being able to say, here's some of those things and here's how it would manifest. And then they can take it and do something with it.
Cool. I'm really interested in how in the design, like digging a little even deeper into the design components, knowing that like war games were always something generals would do, right? And you have the picture of the war room and all of that. And of course, we know that, global corporations have done scenario planning and all kinds of futuring kind of work. But this strikes me as being different in some way. And I wonder if you could kind of get at how this operates in today's world in a way that's different from some of the 20th century history of how futures were imagined.
Yeah, that's great. And so I'll give you kind of on the future casting side, we'll talk about the robots. And so what's different about this, and for anybody has done foresight work and thinks about foresight and futurists, is it's not scenario planning, where you hear about scenario planning, and scenario planning is a very specific thing and really, really important. But with threat casting and future casting, it is very micro. So again, a single person in a single place experiencing a threat. And the pandemic taught us anything. Who you are and where you are really matters. And oftentimes that also helps us to seed it around sort of inclusion and whose future and who gets to design the future and who has power over that future. So it really allows you to dig into those really important conversations. And then you do it multiple times. So when you're doing this in the participatory design, you're not only doing a single person. Again, we have 20 to 70 people, which means we could have up to 20 different groups, which means we do this 3 and 4 times. So doing that math, you start to create lots of, and I'm a data person, so you have all these different data points of these people in places experiencing these threats, so that you can then start to do an aggregation on that and do a breakdown of it, of start thinking about how do you do an analysis of it and a semantic analysis of it to really say this is what the data says. And that's sort of what I do and what I train people to do that. And it gives you a much more robust way of modeling the future. And people then can use it for war games. People can use it for product specs and things like that. So I mentioned, so we had this project called 21st Century Robot that we started at Intel and has moved on from them. And it was basically looking at the future of social robots. So at Intel, part of my job as the futurist was look 10 years out. And we said, well, okay, what would it be like to have a social robot? And this was 15 years ago. What would it be like to have a social robot? Like a smartphone, but a smartphone that walks around and talks to you. You couldn't build it. We didn't have you couldn't actually build it. We spec'd it out and it was like $1 million to build it. And we're like, no, we can't build it. So we started doing it in science fiction. So we started designing, we did science fiction stories to say, what would it be like to act and interact with these robots? And my robot's name was Jimmy. So what would it be like to be with Jimmy? And then I worked with my creative partner and he would draw Jimmy in all these different areas. And we did that for a very long time. We had multiple stories. They were published in academic journals and in technical journals of sort of understanding that, and they were using science fiction as a requirements document. So it was the thing to say, this is what you need to build. To the point when we actually could build the robots, we would pass it to like the mechanical designer. And there's this, Jimmy's about this tall. And so there's a part in one of the stories where Jimmy looks up at the main character. Well, the mechanical designer was like, oh, so he needs a hinged neck. I was like, yeah, he does. And you would we'd pass it through all the different levels of design, and people like the people who did the AI, which I'm more of a systems architect, they'd be like, oh, okay, here's how we would build that AI. Here's what it needs to do. So you would see this sort of legacy of many years of science fiction stories becoming the basically raw material upon which a product was actually built. An actual thing sort of was built. And it happened. I mean, we built Jimmy and took Jimmy all over the world and sort of showed people what it could look like. And we were joking before, when you build robots, I don't know if we have any people who build robots here, you roll deep. It takes a team to build it, right? And so that means you're carrying around lots of robots because robots break. That's what they do. And they fall over and they get confused and they overheat and they've got to take a nap. And that's how you know it's real technology, because it breaks. And so we travel all over, but to do it, when you travel with them, you got to fly with them. You can't check them. Well, when you fly with them, you got to put them in a baby Bjorn. So you would have a whole robot team walking through all over the world. And we were kind of big guys. And so we were walking around and we all have robots on our chests. And people would just like see all these people walking through the airport and be like, that's weird. And then we would sit down and start playing with them because we're bored and we're geeks. And so we're playing with them in airports, and it was like the Pied Piper. I don't know where all these children came from, but it was just boom, kids everywhere. And that came from that sort of type of design, of that whole process of coming through, of turning it from something you couldn't build, you could only build in your imagination, and you could only design forward, to then actually going through and having the mechanical engineer say, oh, okay, that's the requirements document.
Great. Do we have any questions from our audience? If you all have questions, there's a microphone up there to please just walk up there. Yeah.
And as I go, before you ask your question, I'm reading you in. No, don't step away. I can tell you the one thing a robot must do to be accepted by people, but that's what we'll do right at the end. So to keep everybody on the edge of the seat, there's only one thing that a robot must do to be accepted by every piece of humanity.
This thing on? Okay, sweet. Hi, Brian. My name's Everett. I'm a graduate graphic design student here. What you're talking about is largely around what my thesis is on this next year. And I'm going to ask you a very blunt series of questions, just two.
Let's do it.
Have you ever done science fiction prototyping centered around the threats or opportunities that marginalized communities in the U.S., particularly the Black community, face?
Yes.
that's the first question.
So let me tell you real quick. So definitely have done a lot of work. I did a project we're happy to talk to you about later on called The Future of the American Dream, and going and using it as a platform, doing futures work, doing sci-fi prototyping, because those questions became up around who's America, whose dream, who has the power to be able to do those things. And it was a way to really quickly, but do it in a generative form to say, well, what do you want your future to be? We need to own our history, but we need to sort of talk about what we need to do next. And so I've done that. And then another project, which I'm happy to share with you, I did with a nonpartisan group in DC, looking at the future of democracy. And so going to different, doing community design. So it was really awesome. It was not only in the US, but in Latin America, in Africa, as well as Asia, and actually going people to say, let's look at the intersection between the future of democracy and technology, and how can we use that to enable these folks? And then we turned it into science fiction stories. There's a bunch of different areas. And I think it can be a really powerful tool because you're giving those groups agency to say, no, let's talk about building it, and then talk about what you need to kind of get there. So I'm very passionate about it, as you can see.
I'd love to talk to you more about it later. That's great. Thanks. And then the second question I have, is, has a Black person ever led a team of the things that you do before? Because I suspect that the lens would be very different from what is probably a majority of.
We do. And you've hit upon sort of the really kind of this big part of this is when we're doing this work, it's very analyst driven. So futurist driven. And so we're very present around who's the lead analyst, who's the second and third analyst. What does that look like? And we lead with our bias. So we lead with it, and we actually then say, well, who is not in the room? Who needs to be in the room? Not only from an analyst standpoint, but also when we're doing that participatory design. And we've actually reduced it to math. We've actually said, okay, from a sort of ethnicity, race, color, gender, age, background, we actually make a spreadsheet to say, okay, these are the people. And if we don't fill that seat, then we recognize it. We say, we are not getting this. We are getting this 25% wrong because we couldn't get those people in the room. So we commit to then go back and do it. But there's a gentleman by the name of Dr. Michael Bennett. He's now based in Chicago, an incredible futurist, African-American, also has a legal background. So he and I have done a lot of work. And again, if you can just follow up, I'll give you all this information, especially if it's for your work. Yeah. So there's sort of several folks, and a lot of the folks who come into my lab at ASU, that's a big focus of ours, of actually making sure that the people who are being analysts and the ones who are generating these futures are not people who look like me.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that gets to the social dimension, right? And so I'm curious for designers or let's say illustrators in our entertainment design programs, or concept artists, people who are creating futures more in an entertainment capacity, but also in that sort of the necessity of imagining the new product is a form of futuring. What I want to understand from you is what kind of education can support that future imagining so that it is critical and well-informed and in fact useful in specific maybe applied contexts.
Yeah, and that applied word is the one that's really important. So I'll answer the back part of the question first, and then go to the front. So the back part of it is, so if you studied with me, you can't get a degree in future casting or threat casting because it's an applied. So you have to be an engineer. You have to be a designer. You have to be somebody who's being a business student. And so it's basically what I do is then train people to then use this type of thinking to then apply it to what they're doing. And so in that way, it's always drafting off of something else. Now you can get a degree certainly in foresight, which is great to be able to go through and do that. But the type of foresight that I do is so specific in being sort of industrial and applied. Going back to what you were saying, that's why I'm at a university. I mean, I am a big fan of intellectual rigor. It is incredibly important to be trained. Like I always tell people, I'm not talking about mathematicians, but I'm saying you always have to show your math. Like you actually have to show how you came up with this and how you did it, and to be able to understand that it's based upon some sort of training, some sort of background. So I think it's the intersection between those two things, and actually coming from a place where you can show your work, a place where you can build off of what other people have done. But then as that sort of special secret sauce is to be able to then, how do you accelerate it to then use this futurist type thinking and do it in a way that from a social kind of component is pushing you to how you would want to do it. And you think about not only this is the product, but what is the product that you think should be built? Because we're always talking about a range of possible potential futures. And again, embracing the bias of the designer to be able to say, okay, well, as a designer, I know here, this is the spec, but it's not just one future. I think that's one of the things that when we think about the future, and I've written about this a lot, that people have a misconception about the future that it's fixed, and it's not. The future is built every day by the actions of people. Like this group will build the future. You have to understand, as an individual, as a group, as a school, you shape the future. It's built by people. And people talk about it. They're like, well, what will it be like in the future? How do I prepare for the future? And as if it's fixed, like we're all going to Des Moines. And I love Des Moines, Iowa, but it's like, what will it be like in Des Moines, Iowa? How do I prepare? What are the skills I need for Des Moines? And I was like, y'all, I mean, again, I love Des Moines, but like we can go to Seattle. Like Seattle's cool too. And trying to break people out of that as well, which I think, all kidding aside, is a big part of this, especially as designers, to go, no, you have a much more broader range of possible potential futures, even, and this is where I think from a filmmaking standpoint, as important is to get right up to the edge of the possible and into the impossible. And that's where sci-fi and a lot of this gets really good, and you start cooking, because that's where you make real change, is when you go into the impossible and you actually can figure out how to make that happen.
Okay. Here we have a question right here. I would prefer, if you can, because otherwise our people who are online can't hear your question. Or, well, I guess I could repeat it for you, but too late now.
This is where the theme music is needed. Da, 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 da.
I don't know if I'm going to be too articulate in forming my question, but you were saying something that really excited me a little bit. And would you ever I don't know how much you know of ArtCenter, but would you come and evaluate the program and kind of say, okay, in order to, because I thought you said, what product should I design? Am I designing something that, dinosaur shoes, or am I, designing something that's going to be neat? You don't think in the present, you think in 10 years from now, what's going to, and it's kind of like, okay, so but take a really critical look at what ArtCenter is doing with the students, or how they're approaching it, and be brutal, and kind of say, yeah, you guys are fucking it all up. You need to do this.
Oh yeah, sign me up. No, yeah, but be careful, because the future can be dangerous sometimes. I totally sign me up. I've been talking, and that's why I brought gifts as well, because I want to be invited back. But I will give you an example. So I have done this with schools before, and in my position at ASU, they love it when I do this type of stuff. But I did a work with a community college, and I'm a product of community colleges with up in Canada. And I went to them. Yeah, I mean, community colleges. And so I went to them, and we brought in the local business folks, who brought in the local people, because community colleges are about business and the community, it's in the name, but all of that, right? And so I went off, and it was great, and we were all friends and having a great time. And then I went off and I did my work, and I came back, and I was brutal. And I came back and said, I think we should do this and that. And they're like, yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's great. And then I was talking to the professors, and I'm not saying I'm going to say this to the professors here, but I said to them, I said, if you want to be really nimble, because I think about not the next big thing, but the thing that comes after the thing and how to prepare for that. I said, if you do that, actually functionally, what you have to do is you have to change your curriculum by 15 to 25% every single year. And if you want to be really successful, I think you should be rewarded for changing it 50%. Silence. And it was all of a sudden it was like you were on a date, and they want to have kids, but you don't want to have kids. There's no going back from there. I was like, I'm going back home. So no, I would actually love to do that. I think that would be a great idea.
So you're interested in the singularity after the singularity. Is that what? Okay, so we need to bring this to a close now. And so I want to conclude by reminding everyone. Oh, Do we have time for one more? Okay, we have time for one more.
One more, and then the secret about robots.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. When it comes to robots, with AI, is it empowerment or a threat? And then how should students be responding to it? How should they adapt to the age of AI?
Well, I think the short of it is to remember AI is a technology. Don't imbue it with too much power. It's still built by people. Even when it's autonomous, we build it. And know that we need to have those tough conversations about AI. But generally, if you're talking about the future of the AI, you're actually having the wrong question. You're having the wrong conversation. You're asking the wrong question. It's about who's going to use that AI and what are they going to do with it. Going back to the previous conversation, I think that's really important. Oftentimes people talk about technology like the smartphones are going to take over the world and destroy our children. It's like, nope, the smartphones aren't doing anything. They're just sitting there. That's not there. It's actually about people, and always bringing the conversation back to people, I think becomes really important. And for me, it's using AI as a tool. I mean, artificial intelligence is really a tool, and sort of asking, what are you optimizing for and what are you trying to get done? But don't give it too much power. So I'm sort of super excited about what it can do, but I'm an engineer and a geek. So, but I do think we're at a really good, important to hold ourselves accountable to what we're building.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. And now it's time for the magic secret.
Okay. The secret. Now, does everybody want to know this secret? Wow. That's why I'm at. Because I told you the future is very dangerous, people. You cannot unhear what I'm about to tell you. There's no going back. Like, you are going to leave this room changed individuals. You'll mark this in your life. Like, you will tell your children and your children's children. If you don't have children, you might have children, just to tell them this. Just saying. Like, I've seen this happen. I've been doing this for a while. So, like, okay, here we go. Can you share this online? You can. But be careful. Again, well, I go back to, the great American philosopher Stan Lee. With great power comes great responsibility. And you're going to have it. Okay, so I've been on rollout for years, travel all over the world. So there's one thing that a robot must do to be accepted by all humanity. It must fart. I know your minds are just blown. I heard it. Did you hear it? I could even hear on the Zoom. Here's why, though. Imagine it. So I've been in rooms of people where you have a robot and it's walking across, it stops, farts, giggles, does this, and then keeps going. Everybody thinks that thing can't take over the world. It just farted. Like, and you watch like a room full of kids just lose their minds. They like roll on the floor, and now they like love this robot and they run up and hug it, which is not a good thing. And so they run up and hug it. But I've actually been at the offices of iRobot and done it as well. If anybody wants to know, it's an interrupt function. It actually lives below the BIOS. It's a random number generator that just sort of goes. Once it hits that thing, it then fires a media file that then has it go and do it. And if you want to have a really flatulent robot, you set the random number generator at like 100. And if you want to have sort of a normal one, you set it at like 5 million or whatever, and it just kind of goes. But I'll tell you, it actually works. I've seen it work sort of all across the land. So yes, if you want a robot to be accepted by humanity, it must fart.
Excellent. Thank you. The next time that I have a little mistake, I'll say, I'm sorry, what was it? The media file?
Yes, your random number generator just came up. And you can tell people, I just want you to like me.
All right. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.